I want to take on a couple of topics in this video, but the first one's very brief. Employee training. We already know this, but this is just a reminder that every wireless LAN security program must include an employee training element. One of the ways that we often do employee training, by the way, and this is just kind of an aside, is something we call simulated phishing. The idea is that the company puts out emails to its employees just to see who will click on links that they shouldn't be clicking on. Kind of a interesting way of doing it. Typically, these are not used for punitive purposes, but to develop a training plan. All right, now I really want to get into this 802.1x. There are three parts to an 802.1x system. Now, again, remember, this is that radius server thing, whereby somebody wants to log on to a wireless access point. They have to provide their credentials, their username, their password, and those credentials are different for each person, unlike the one you have at home where you use the same password for every device. All right, 802.1x has three parts to it: a supplicant, an authenticator, and an authentication server. Let's take a look at where those are in the topology here. So here is our user on this laptop. The user wants to log on to this wireless access point, and this wireless access point is the authenticator, whereas the user is the supplicant. In other words, the authenticator is the one that tells this guy whether or not he or she can log on. However, the authenticator in this case doesn't do the actual authentication. It relays that information across this switch here down to this Radius 802.1x server. This server, in turn, will do the authentication. It will go into its database and determine whether or not that user with that password is authenticatable, and if so, it will relay that back to the authenticator, who will then grant access to the supplicant. Now, how does it do all that? Here are the set of steps in a more detailed manner. So first of all, it uses typically something called EAP and Radius together. So EAP is a framework that is used to communicate between the supplicant, the authenticator, and the authentication server. Here's how it works. The supplicant creates an EAP request frame. So that would be this computer. It says, okay, I'm going to give you an EAP request to the authenticator for logon. Now, the authenticator is going to it's going to frame these in something called an EAPOL, and that just means EAP over LAN. Now the authenticator is going to encrypt the EAP frame, usually using an encryption scheme called TLS, or Transport Layer Security. Previously we used to use SSH, but Secure Shell was not as robust as we needed it to be, so today we use TLS. So the authenticators are encrypting that EAP request frame, and the authenticator in turn puts that frame into a Radius packet. Now the EAP the Radius packet is an authentication request packet, a Radius authentication request packet. And it sends that to the authentication server down here. The authentication server then reads that Radius packet, and it either allows it or rejects it. Now the authentication server reads that. Now the authentication server reads the request and either accepts or rejects, and will send a Radius accept. And now the authentication server will read that Radius request. Now the authentication server will read that Radius access request and either send a Radius access accept or an access reject packet back to the authenticator. The authenticator in turn now extracts the EAP success or EAP failure message from the Radius packet and then sends the information back to the supplicant that says either you're on or you're not on. The authenticator either allows or denies the authentication of the supplicant. Now that is a lot of information about how these things work together, but even this is relatively high level, but just know that all of this is done through EAP communication, and that the authenticator then creates a radius. So just remember that this laptop is creating an EAP access request. The authenticator is taking that and creating a radius access request. The server down here is now sending back a radius access accept or deny to the authenticator, and then the authenticator in turn is sending back either an EAP accept or deny to the supplicant.